Hello, this is Mike Burek, your host and producer of Knanitsia, The Well, a podcast series about topics of interest to the global Ukrainian community. Today is Wednesday, January 8th, 2025. This episode is produced for The Ukrainian Weekly, a newspaper published in English for the global Ukrainian community since 1933. Our guest today is Taras Kuzio, who is professor of political science at National University of Kiev-Mohyla Academy in Kiev, Ukraine. Welcome, Professor Kuzio. How are you?
I'm very well on this cold day in England. Thank you for inviting me to this podcast.
And it's cold here as well in the U.S. today. Thanks for joining us. Can you start off with telling us a little bit about your professional background?
Sure. I've been involved in with Ukraine since about the mid 1980s. In then I was running a press agency in London called the Ukrainian Press Agency, which was involved in publishing information from Ukraine in English and in Ukrainian, and also smuggling diaspora Western literature and Ukrainian diaspora literature into Soviet Ukraine. From the 1990s, I've been involved. I've had two hats really, one academic, one journalist. I've worked at various universities in Britain, Canada, where I spent 15 years in Toronto, working in both Canadian and American universities, and also think tanks, and also writing for a variety of, I would say, probably more specialist publications dealing with Ukraine and the former Soviet Union. Um, in total, I have about 24 authored and edited books, primarily dealing with Ukraine, but also Ukraine in a broader context. The most recent of these books are Russian Nationalism and the Russian-Ukrainian War, published in the same month that Russia launched its full-scale invasion in February 2022, and also more recently books dealing with how Russian disinformation and propaganda is entering Western academia and Western journalistic writing about the war and about Ukraine, and also a book about the with my nephew Stefan Yechnik, Kelman, about the actual invasion itself and the manner in which Russia has attempted to physically liquidate and is pursuing a policy of genocide against the Ukrainian people. So currently, I have two ongoing book projects. One with a colleague from Poland. We are writing a book about the four routes of the full-scale invasion. And the second book is with another British colleague, which is more an edited collection, and that's about how we think it's time for us to describe Russia as a fascist state. So those are the two ongoing current projects. I did hope at my time of life I would be reducing my need to write and slowly going into retirement, but a little Stalin Hitler figure in Moscow has prevented that with his war against Ukraine and against the West.
Professor, what is your current assessment of the Russian war against Ukraine?
Well, this is of course a big subject, but I would say that um, if I was to use the analogy of if is the glass half full or half empty, I would say it's more half full than half empty. Um, I mean, let's remember that at the beginning of the invasion, in the early part of 2022, probably 90%, I would say, at least, of Western policymakers, academics, and think tank so-called experts all believed in the mythology that Russia had the second best army in the world and that Ukraine would be quickly conquered. This was the view of the Biden administration in the US. And hence why they only supplied Ukraine with weapons useful for guerrilla warfare, such as stingers, NLAWs, and other forms of kind of light weaponry, shall we say. Um, the West only began to supply Ukraine with heavy weaponry from April of 2022 when Russian forces were ejected from the Kiev region. So the West got it wrong, and the West keeps getting, I think, Ukraine wrong in the sense that they are unable to see to what degree Ukraine has been incredible as a country and people in its resilience and resistance against Russia's genocidal war against Ukraine. So from that perspective, the very fact that we are um, saying and seeing that Ukraine has been able to hold off Russia, this huge country, nuclear power state, with a far bigger population than Ukraine, has been able to hold off Russia for 3 years is an incredible achievement. And let's remember that Russia now has 800,000 casualties, that's killed and wounded. But as we know, most of Russia's wounded tend to die. Now, that already in itself is incredible as a figure, because that is 16 times more than Soviet casualties in Afghanistan, which were 50,000 over 10 years. So 50,000 over 10 years for the Soviet Union in Afghanistan and 800,000 over only 3 years for Russia in Ukraine. Um, so Russia has, yes, it's achieved some success, but very, very small in terms of the territory it's taken. Russia has shown that it's not able to launch major kind of offensives. These are very small, incremental advances in not very strategically important places in the Donbass. Russia has been unable to, for example, take areas of Kharkiv. And let's remember the city of Kharkiv, which is the second biggest in Ukraine after Kiev, is only 30 or 50 miles from the Russian border. But Russia has failed. Ukraine also has been able to occupy an area of Russia in Kursk, which again, many in the West were surprised about, as they were in Russia, and Russia has been unable to eject those troops from the Russian region of Kursk. So I would say it's obviously a mixed picture. Ukraine has not been successful in its counteroffensive in 2023 in ejecting Russian occupation forces from the southeast of the country, from southern Zaporizhia, eastern Kherson, and of course Donetsk and Luhansk. At the same time, Russia has not really moved very far ahead in its objectives, and this will be important in upcoming peace talks because Russia has not achieved its goals in Ukraine. Its goals were certainly to destroy Ukraine as a country and transform it into a little Russia, to also occupy the big cities of Ukraine, Odessa, Kiev, Kharkiv, Dnipro, because Russian nationalists describe these as Russian cities. Russia has not been able to do that, and in the four regions that Russia has illegally annexed, Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson, Russia doesn't control 100% of any of these. So I think the picture is positive in Ukraine's direction. Of course, a lot depends on what happens in the next few months and what happens in with the Trump administration. But I think the final thing to bring out for Ukraine as a positive achievement is that with Zelensky has been just incredible. I mean, there's no question he should be compared to Winston Churchill in World War II. And that's saying by myself, somebody who was skeptical about him after he was elected in 2019. But Ukraine has also been very successful in rebuilding its military industrial complex. And a lot of the weaponry that Ukraine now uses is built inside Ukraine. It's not just brought from the West anymore. Some of that is funded by Western governments, particularly Denmark here. But it's also money, of course, taken from the interest accrued from the $300 billion dollars of Russian assets, which have been frozen since the full-scale invasion. So Ukraine has been quite successful as well in that area. So I think all hats off to Ukrainians for their incredible achievements in holding off this evil Russian imperialism.
Professor, do you think Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky is ready for peace negotiations with Russia?
He's ready for some kind of deal. Yes, I think he understands that it would be good for Ukraine to have a break. And in many ways, what we don't know the final proposals coming out of the Trump team, but what has been said so far actually works in favor of Ukraine more than it works in favor of Russia. Obviously the downside to this is that about 18 or 20% of Ukraine would continue to be occupied by Russia, but Ukraine would never recognize that, and no Western government would recognize this territory as belonging to Russia. This is a Russian demand, but it will never happen. Russia's demand is also that Ukraine give up the parts of those four regions, Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, Kherson, which it currently doesn't control. Again, Ukraine would never agree to this. If we were to impose, as the Trump plan seems to suggest, a kind of a frozen conflict on the current contact line, the military contact line, um, Ukraine might be willing to agree to that because it would allow for the rebuilding of the country, the return of refugees, children returning to schools, all of those kinds of things, an end to daily bombardments of missiles and drones. But at the same time, Russia would not, because Russia would not have achieved its goals of occupying these major Ukrainian cities, particularly Kiev and Kharkiv, and a part of Russia in Kursk would continue to be controlled by Ukraine. So this, as we've already heard, President Putin and Foreign Minister Lavrov and the Russian ambassador to the UN have all turned down Trump's proposals. So from a Zelensky's point of view, um, yes, I think he is saying that Ukraine might be ready for this. Opinion polls in Ukraine tend to go along with this, but of course, the big, shall we say, elephant in the room is the question of how to make this long-standing, how to bring in security guarantees to prevent Russia from restarting the war down the road. And that, I think, is a major question which still has not been resolved, and which is what President Zelensky keeps raising. Ukrainians have a very bad memory of failed security guarantees, which the US under President Obama and Britain under Prime Minister Cameron ignored in 2014. Ukraine was given security guarantees by the Budapest Memorandum in 1994 in return for nuclear disarmament, and those were shown to be worthless. So Ukraine would never go down that same road. It would demand ironclad security guarantees, which I think are still being out there debated. They still have not been resolved. And that would also probably require a large number of troops, 50, 60,000 foreign troops, maybe Europeans primarily, to be standing on that contact line. Again, that still has to be resolved.
Professor, what role do you think the U.S. will play in any peace negotiations between Russia and Ukraine after Donald Trump is inaugurated as U.S. president on January 20th?
Trying to predict Donald Trump is simply impossible to do. He is so unpredictable. he can say one thing in the morning and say something completely contradictory in the evening. This is typical of all populists. Um, they tend to, um, as it were, shift with the winds very frequently. Um, Judging by what has been said until now by the more saner members surrounding Trump, like General Kellogg and others, um, the the Trump proposals are look likely to be better for Ukraine, and Russia will never agree to them. Now, that works in favor of Ukraine, because according to what we've heard until now, at least, um, the US will provide Ukraine with an increased amount of military aid if Russia turns down peace proposals. Because not only because Russia would have turned down the peace proposals, and refused to say, shall we say, negotiate, but also because there is I think, a widespread understanding that Ukraine would have to enter any peace negotiations from a position of strength. So ironically, the MAGA uh, crowd in the Republican Party would have to swallow the fact that the US may have to increase its military aid and maybe allow Ukraine to take the gloves off, for example, to allow Ukraine to fire inside Russia with US weapons, which would be actually better than what took place under President Biden, where there were many restrictions on how Ukraine could use US weapons, and the weapons were supplied in a very drip fashion. So, um, as we from what we know at the moment, the proposals put forward by members of the Trump team to end this war, which now will be ended not in a day, as Trump originally said, but maybe within 6 months. Trump now says it's a more complicated war than what we have in the Middle East. That is more likely to be something that Ukraine would go along with than Russia. And I think that could actually work very much in Ukraine's favor. But the fear would be always, and this is the fear at the back of everybody's mind, is the degree to which Trump showed at times that he was quite willing to, as it were, be pro-Putin during his first presidency. Now, I want to say straight away that this is Trump was always a mixed picture. For example, Obama vetoed the weapons supplies to Ukraine. Trump did not veto them. And also, Trump imposed sanctions on Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline between Russia and Germany, and Biden lifted those sanctions. So it's a very mixed picture. And in 2018, when Russia tried to poison defector Sergei Skripal in Britain, the biggest number of Russian agents expelled from any Western country was from the US under Trump. So it's a very mixed picture. So just to conclude, at the moment, at least, what we know from the Trump team, the proposals are more favorable towards Ukraine than they are to Russia. So, but we shall obviously see the writing will be on the wall when these meetings and visits and negotiations begin.
Unfortunately, we're just about out of time, but I do want to ask one final question. Do you think Russian President Putin will ever be satisfied with Ukraine being an independent state that follows its own course in the world?
No, never. As long as Putin is alive, he will be waging war against Ukraine and against the West. He has nowhere else to go. Um, he can't retreat now. And he is absolutely convinced, as are all of his cronies around him in the Kremlin and in the Russian media and state officials, that Ukraine is a fake US puppet state, that Ukrainians are little Russians and they have to come home to Mother Russia. So Putin will never move away from that. Simply, he cannot. If he were to sort of backtrack away from this position, he would not be he would not stay in power very long. He has created a massive xenophobic, chauvinistic Russian nationalist kind of majority inside Russia that is absolutely convinced that of the need to destroy the Ukrainian state and to destroy Ukrainian identity and transform Ukrainians into little Russians.
Professor Kuzio, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for inviting me, and Happy New Year.
Happy New Year. I have been speaking with Professor Taras Kuzio, who is a professor of political science at National University of Kyiv-Mohyla Academy in Kyiv, Ukraine. And I'm Mike Burek, your host and producer of Kunitsia. This episode is produced for The Ukrainian Weekly, a newspaper published in English for the global Ukrainian community since 1933. Until next time, that's all for now.